Right, good morning, Year 8. We're going to continue with our unit of work on Shakespearean heroes and villains. Over the last 5 presentations, over last week, I looked at Richard III with you. And you probably should now be getting the idea of how this is going to be structured. Okay, so with Richard III, we went through some of his language, his soliloquy at the beginning of the play, and some of the information about him towards the end of the play, coming to the conclusion of the play where he is killed in battle at Bosworth. And based on all of that, you are now making a judgment about how he is villainous, how he might have some heroic, at least some attractive, some maybe some traits that you could admire. But at the end of the day, you'll be thinking to yourself, right, I'm going to make a judgment about how villainous is this particular character compared to the next 2 who I'll be going through over the next couple of weeks. Okay? Now, the next character we're looking at is Lady Macbeth. What I said at the end of the last presentation was that Shakespeare was developing always as a writer and as a playwright across quite a long career. And one thing I said was that he no doubt actually found some elements in some of the earlier plays that he did and thought they would make very, very interesting things actually to introduce into my later plays. The later plays tended to be ones, the tragedies particularly, tended to be ones which explored human nature rather than simply told a story. And by that I mean if you look at things like Macbeth, it explores, as we'll look at, the nature of ambition, the nature of how we present ourselves. If you look at Hamlet, it looks at the massive questions about what is the purpose of life, which religious people, philosophers, writers have been looking at for thousands and thousands of years. If you look at King Lear, it's the nature of existence and the nature of our emotions, our mentality. Okay? So he explored much deeper things the further into career he's got. But there's no doubt that when he was looking at Richard III, there were some very interesting ideas that he wanted to develop. One of which I mentioned with this idea about what it is to be both a king and a man. And we often think of our public figures, so you think of people like Boris Johnson nowadays, we see him as a prime minister, we see Donald Trump as the president, but sometimes we seem to forget that these people are also human in their own right with those emotions. Okay? The other thing, of course, we looked at in Richard III was that sort of idea between somebody being through and through bad, but having elements of something else about them. Now, the thing with Richard III, obviously, that an Elizabethan audience in the mid to late 16th century would have had absolutely no doubt that he was meant to be a villain. He was bad. So they might have found it quite a strange thing that they actually started to admire certain things about him. Might admire his bravery, the way he sort of saw himself out in battle. They might admire his determination. They might even admire the honesty about his dishonesty. Okay? But there's no doubt at all that they would have been entertained by him, and that's exactly what Shakespeare set out to do when he started that play off with a soliloquy. It was very much about, come on this journey with me, and I'll entertain you for the next couple of hours. And with a great satisfaction at the end when he gets his comeuppance, as is often the case. But we do find bad characters quite attractive sometimes. Macbeth is slightly different. Macbeth is called the tragedy of Macbeth. I'll talk about conventions of tragedy in a moment. But what we see in Macbeth is different, because in the beginning of Richard III, he very clearly says, I am a villain, and I'm going to be bad. Whereas in the beginning of Macbeth, and throughout it, what we see is somebody, albeit he is violent as a warrior, albeit he is determined and all of those sort of things, he has many, many very good characteristics. Okay, he's almost the hero at the beginning of the play. And what we see throughout the play is his decline, okay, into becoming a very, very evil character. Okay? Strangely, the character that we're looking at today is one who starts off quite evil, but can't cope with the guilt of her behaviour and what she does, and she goes the other way. And at some point in the play, they meet in this sort of journeys that they go on. We call that acrostic. Okay. I mentioned about tragedy. Okay, obviously we can all relate to tragedy in the way things are at the moment. But an Elizabethan audience, a Shakespearean audience, would have seen tragedy in a somewhat different way. There have been dramatic conventions to tragedy, which we'll go through, and you're going to be doing a unit of work next year which will be exploring this. But one of the things about conventions of tragedy is it tended to be that the person, the title, if you like, so Macbeth, King Lear, Othello, Hamlet, and so on, would have been highborn. So when there is a decline in their conduct and ultimately their deaths, it has an impact on the whole state, on everybody there. If it was just any old person who we watched their decline, it's not going to impact on that many other people around their family and friends. So it wouldn't have had the same impact. And that's one convention of tragedy that obviously we look at. Another convention of tragedy that we look at is this person has what is called a fatal flaw. Okay? A fatal flaw is that one thing about their personality which causes that downfall. Okay? Hamlet, in his play, called it a vicious mole of nature. It's that one thing within us we can show many, many good traits, good characteristics, positives, but that one thing about us which takes over our personality and causes that downfall. And usually through what we call hubris, through our pride, we don't see that, we're not aware of it till far too late. Now, like I said, in Macbeth, it is ambition. And you could probably argue it's the same sort of thing in Richard III. It was the ambition to actually be king, which absolutely overtakes any other sentiments and characteristics that he has. In something like Romeo and Juliet, not through a sort of famous tragedy, but obviously it is a tragic tale, it's the blind faith in love of these two young people. In Othello, as I've said, it is jealousy, this one thing about it. Many, many wonderful things about Othello. A good man, a decent man, a very, very good warrior, a good friend to people, trusting, all of those sort of things, loyal, but is absolutely overcome by jealousy and does something terrible at the end of the play because of it. Okay, so there would have been that convention to it as well, and I'll be mentioning things like fatal flaw in due course. Okay, so we're going to look at Macbeth. It is a play that you will be looking at later on in your school careers. I'm not going to go through it in huge amounts of depth, but it is quite important that even before the character of Macbeth comes in, and Lady Macbeth, we establish a few sort of themes and ideas. Okay, so what I thought I'd do is we'll start off just like we did last time, looking at a few of the posters which relate to the play. Okay, and this one very much relates to another convention of tragedy. So here we have Macbeth, okay, and you can see there are a couple of quite sort of skeletal hands attached to strings controlling Macbeth. He's almost like the puppet. And a convention of tragedy as well is that the person, the protagonist we call them, the main person in that play, is somehow dictated to and led and controlled, but tries to take on a power much greater than themselves. And usually that is the power of fate. Now, in Macbeth, you could also argue this is what we call the power of the supernatural. We'll come on to that in 5 minutes or so. But you've got nonetheless these skeletal hands which are controlling Macbeth. Okay. This is a similar sort of idea. You can see you've got these sort of puppets, puppet master's hands as well. But these are very much attached to Macbeth's mind rather than just body and what he does. Okay? And this is again very much actually to do with someone manipulating the way that character thinks, not just the way he acts, but the way he thinks as well. The journey from going to somebody who is brave and loyal and all of those things to somebody who is the absolute antithesis, the absolute opposite of that, okay, and ultimately kills the person who he should be most loyal to in his king. Okay, so it's someone being dragged every which way by a power greater than themselves as well. This one is quite an interesting one. It looks quite simple, but what we've got obviously is a portrayal of Macbeth. And you've got that deep red because, I'm going to be honest with you now, Macbeth is a very bloody play. It's a very bloodthirsty play. There's lots of violence in it. Okay? The face, I'm not sure if you can see it absolutely, is probably his wife's face, so Lady Macbeth's face, we'll come on to in a moment, and maybe the influence that she has over him. It might also suggest that all of us have what we call a duality to what we are. Okay, there's one side of us which is one way, and another side of us which is another way. We might be very, very kind and compassionate and empathetic people, but we might have a bit of a cruel streak to us. We might sometimes be very confident about ourselves and come across that way and be loud, but you put your head on the pillow at the end of the day, and there's a quietness about you, actually, in a sort of soul searching and so on. So it's about how we often have two sides to our personality. Now, there's another word that I mentioned when we were going through Richard III, which is this one, motif. And a motif is an image or a theme or idea which comes up and is repeated again and again throughout the play. And there's a motif which runs throughout a lot of Shakespeare, particularly his tragedies, particularly things like Macbeth. And that is how we tend to put on disguises. It's that duality again, it's the two sides of our personality. And it's about how we very, very often as people, not just in the context of school, not just in the context of work, but in families and relationships and everything we do, we put on disguises all the time. I don't mean actual physical disguises, I mean it's the way we conduct ourselves, okay? Lady Macbeth particularly is always urging her husband Macbeth to do this. Appear one way, be something else underneath. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. We'll come on to that sort of thing later on. Okay, so that's a very important idea, the idea of appearance versus reality. This one you may be able to see, which is quite important. I'm just going to check we're still recording. I had some issues with this yesterday. Okay, this one you may be able to see. It's got that same sort of blood colour to it, and it's got a knife in it, which is very, very important for the narrative of this play. But you've also got three shapes like that, and they are meant to represent the thing which is hat. Okay, so you've got three witches, and this is what is this plays, the beginning of it at least, is very, very famous for, is this scene, Act 1, Scene 1, which is to do with the three witches coming on. And it's probably something there is Shakespeare, whether it's language that you might even use in your day-to-day conversations. But sometimes it's just things, images and ideas that you've become aware of, which actually are through Shakespeare. And this idea of the three witches, or the three weird sisters, this coven of witches, is something which is absolutely synonymous, and this play is particularly famous for at the beginning. However, a lot of people actually get their understanding and their interpretation of the meaning of this opening scene, which I'm going to go through now, quite wrong. The reason why I'm going to go through it, because Lady Macbeth doesn't actually appear until Act 1, Scene 5, towards the end of the act. So we've got 4 scenes before she appears. But it's very, very important in order to understand her and the nature of her villainy to understand what has come before it. We're not going to look at the rest of the play in the same detail. I'm simply going to look at Act 1, Scene 5, or the beginning of the first act, and a few bits from it, but we're going to look at Act 1, Scene 5 in a little bit more detail, and then what we call the foil to that, which is Act 5, Scene 1, where we see a complete role reversal in her, but we'll come on to that in due course. Okay? What I thought I'd start off with is a clip from a 1970s film, okay? Just by way of illustration about what Act 1, Scene 1 of the play Macbeth is all about. Okay, this is abridged as well. They do tend to do this, which means it has had some of the language taken out of it. But just have a watch of this as soon as advertisement is gone. Here we go.
we meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain.
When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won.
That would be ere the set of sun
Where the face,
upon the heath.
there to meet with Macbeth.
Okay, and you can see what a dramatic opening that would be to a play. You've got to remember that in the context of Shakespeare in England, people were far more superstitious. People definitely had a belief in the supernatural. One of the things that you look at in terms of context of this play is that even the new king, so Elizabeth died in 1603, and a new king comes to the throne who is from Scotland, okay, called James I of England, the first of the Stuart kings, okay. And he was a highly superstitious man. He'd written treaties, so he'd written essays on witchcraft and the supernatural. He even believed that a shipwreck in which he'd been involved was caused by a curse put on him by witches. And there's lots of other archaeological and historical evidence that it wasn't just individuals who actually believed in witchcraft and the supernatural, it was much of society. Okay, and we have evidence from that through things that we find under the floorboards in old Elizabethan houses and so on, which actually were there to ward off spirits and so on and so forth. So when you've got things like ghosts appearing in Shakespearean plays, when you've got witches appearing in Shakespearean plays, these were figures and characters which were there to be believed, okay, and were there to represent not just danger and not just something to be scared of in a sort of, you know, something hiding under the bed type of way, but they were much, much more important. Because remember I said with Richard III there was this idea of order being absolutely key to Elizabethan society, because it was always under threat. The chaos that the supernatural represents was that order being overthrown. So imagine, if you will, you're at the Globe and you're there at 1603, 1604, and this play starts off with witches. It's not just something to be scared of but to find entertaining. It would have been something which represented something quite dangerous and sinister to a Jacobean, James, audience. Okay? So, this is the, like I said, they've mucked about with the order a little bit of the language there, but this in essence is the language of the opening scene. Okay, and I'm just going to go through a couple of things first, okay? The first thing is Shakespeare was quite liberal with his stage direction. Why? Because if you think about things like special effects, last year when you looked in year 7 at Shakespeare in context, and you're looking at Shakespeare in theatre, you'll have known that special effects were very, very limited. You'll have known that a play like Macbeth, which a lot of it takes place at night time and in darkness, as you'd expect if it's about the supernatural and murder and things like that, Shakespearean performances at that time had to take place during the day for safety reasons, because of fire and so on. Okay? So he was quite liberal with his stage direction, the thing that he put in there, but certain things did represent particular ideas. So where it says Act 1, Scene 1, a desert place or a deserted place, in other versions of it I've seen things like a barren place, or it is meant to represent something away from civilization. Okay? Now if you think about it, I said before the Elizabethans are very much about law and order. If you look at Shakespeare's plays, a lot of his comedy plays, like Midsummer Night's Dream and things like that, they start off in the order of the city, where people thought they could control things. And it often works out that you get lots of young people who go out into the woods outside those cities, and it's there that they meet various supernatural beings like fairies and so on, and they fall in and out of love, and it's all very, very funny. But it tended to be that places which were the desert place or a deserted place or a barren place were away from civilization. And that's exactly what these witches represent? They represent the chaos. They represent the chaos that Richard III tried to bring about by getting rid of the rightful king. And that is what this play is all about. This is why I said there are seeds in Richard III which are relevant in this play too. Thunder and lightning. How they chose to achieve that nowadays, if you went to a version of Macbeth at the theatre, they'd have all the lighting, they'd have sound effects and so on. Then they'd have to go about it in a bit of a different way. But that is not the point. I mentioned a literary phrase to you when we did Richard III called pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy is where you have the weather representing somehow the mood. Okay? Now, if I'm sort of saying to you, this opening scene is not just a little bit about witches, it's got far more hard-hitting consequence than that. If I was saying that this is about turning everything upside down, society as we know it, okay, not so dissimilar to what we're talking about at the moment, what weather might be representative of that? Now, if you remember, when we did Richard III, the opening to that soliloquy, now as the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by the son of York, the idea that peacetime was summer. Winter, we should be wartime for the majority. Okay, for obviously for Richard, winter was peace. If I'm saying that everything is being turned upside down by what these witches are about to do, it is somehow appropriate that there is thunder and lightning. There is a storm brewing. There is a storm ahead. Okay? Similarly, when we have enter three witches, special effects might dictate that could happen in various ways nowadays. At the time, it would probably just be that three witches walked onto the stage or appeared on the stage. Okay? But enter three witches. I've seen various performances of it where actually the witches just appear from the audience. They're among the audience. And that was obviously quite a sinister way of doing it because it made people believe those witches were among them all the time. And people would have believed that old lady with the black cat living at the end of the street might well have been a witch. Okay? And then we come on to the actual text itself. You can see, very, very brief. Okay, and there might be elements of this that you have heard of again. I'll just check we're recording still, as I fell foul of that yesterday. So I'll quickly read through it for you again. I'm not going to put on a Scottish accent because we have no evidence the witches themselves were Scottish. We might have to do that when we do Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, but we will wait and see. So, when shall we three meet again in thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, that will be ere the set of sun. Where the place upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. I come, grey Malkin, paddock calls anon. Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. Exeunt means they exit the stage. Okay? Now, what we are seeing here is something which is far more important than often this scene is given credence. Why? Because it introduces not just themes and ideas, but it sets up the entire play. Everything that happens after is because of this simple scene. And lots of people get that wrong, both in teaching it and in learning. Okay? Now the first thing I'd get you to do is just not necessarily related to Macbeth, just have a think about what powers you think one would normally relate to witchcraft. Okay? And usually we would say things like spells or potions, okay, incantations, that sort of idea. We would normally have some idea that they could prophesy, verb, either the future itself, so they could tell what was going to happen, or indeed they might even make it happen by use of spells and potions and things like that, and charms. Another thing that we could say, that this is where we get that stereotypical idea of the witch on her broomstick, the idea of flight. And by flight you mean escape, often. So disappearing, that sort of idea. And very, very often there is a link with animals. Now there might be different ideas as well, different things that you think are the power of witches, but we have this idea of making spells and potions to make things happen. They can prophesy the future or make the future happen in a particular way. This idea of disappearing and the idea of having some link, usually with a particular type of animal, and usually we associate that with black cats and so on. Okay? Now, if we start looking at this, the first which says, I'm going to read it to you one more time, but this time I'm going to actually, what we do, give it the rhythm. Okay? Shakespeare was written in a rhythm and rhyme called iambic stress, iambic pentameter. Okay? I'll put up those words as well because sometimes they are difficult to spell. Okay? Rhythm and rhyme. I'll read it to you again, but in the way that Shakespeare intended, not necessarily it to be heard, but with an understanding of where the stresses lie. And the stress in the iambic pentameter is on the second syllable. So da 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 da. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, that will be ere the set of sun. Da 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 da. And you can see it in the rhyming scheme. Again, rain, done, won, sun. There's a little sort of bit in the middle where we lose it, where the place upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. I come to him out in paddock calls, anon. Fair is foul and foul is fair, hovry folk and filthy, yeah, but. Now, there is a reason why we do this. There's a reason why there is iambic pentameter. If you hear it is representative of your heartbeat. And Shakespearean actors, going back, you know, not just Shakespearean actors, but actors of that time, you know from the context you studied last year that they weren't particularly highly thought of. And very, very often, if you're an actor, you would simply be called on, someone would go to a tavern and said, I need some actors, and you'd go along and you'd get your lines, and it might be that you'd actually have to learn your lines within one afternoon. Not the sort of months that actors have nowadays if they're doing a big performance or anything like that. You might have one afternoon. And it's much easier to learn something which has got a rhythm and a rhyme and somehow is linked in with the beat of your heart than learning something which is just a big piece of prose written in paragraph form. You know that yourself. How often have actually, sometimes subconsciously, have you learnt the lyrics to a song or something like that because of its rhythm and rhyme, but you can't learn something which is written in prose form nearly so easily. So something that's lyrical, song-like, is easier to learn. And that is very much, like I said, to do this idea of the heartbeat. Okay? As soon as I say that it's got that rhythm and rhyme to it, and we are talking about three witches, which ones of these do you think that relates to? Well, obviously they are conjuring a spell. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, that will be ere the set of sun. These three witches are creating a spell, and in the adaptation you just saw, the Polanski adaptation, rather than having a cauldron, they've dug a hole in the ground and they're filling it with things to make something happen. This is happening from the very first lines of the play. They are making the future happen. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? Well, we've already sort of established that that would be appropriate weather for what is going on. But more than that, that witch is not sort of saying, I'm going to put my hand out of the window, and if it happens to be raining, if it happens to be thundering, if it happens to be lightning, then we'll get together. Okay? She is saying, through this, not only do we know what the weather is going to be like when we choose to meet again, but we are going to make it that way. Through this spell, we are going to make it that it is thunder, lightning, and rain. When the hurly-burly, so when all this business is done, when the battle's lost and won. Now, straight after this scene, we actually learn of a battle that Macbeth has been in, which is yet to take place. So it's not a case that them again are saying, when shall we meet, when this battle is over. Not only do they know when the battle is going to take place, but more than that, they know who is going to win it and who is going to lose it. They can prophesy the future. They can make the future happen, and they can prophesy exactly what is going to happen in the future. Okay, and there's little lines throughout this entire play. Macbeth actually says, I'll pick something up here. Macbeth says later on, I'll paraphrase it, but he essentially says, we do not know how the sand of time will fall. Well, not strictly true, because the witches do know. And the person, the character, who is at the core of everything that they know is going to happen is Macbeth. Okay? Just going to check we are Still going, yes. Okay. That will be ere the set of sun. Now, what are they talking about? We are 5 lines in, and we have got to the absolute crux of the whole play, to do the chaos of this whole play, this whole tragedy. This is where I'm saying that Shakespeare used motifs. You know from the beginning of Richard III what that sun represents. At the beginning of Richard III, now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by this son of York. The sun is representative of the king. Do you remember? I said because of the crown and so on. Now, if the witches are saying the set of sun, if we're talking about the weather, is sunset when the sun goes down. If we are talking symbolically, that will be ere the set of sun. That will be when the existing king, who is called King Duncan, Macbeth is not king at the beginning of this play, just like Richard wasn't at the beginning of his play. That will be ere the set of sun. They know that the king is going to be killed. And that would have shocked an Elizabethan audience, because the king was really held as, you know, high esteem. Like I said, a messenger from God. You take the king away, the legitimate, rightful king away from the country, you are taking God away from the country. Okay? So that was a very, very important line. And who's going to facilitate that? Who's going to make it happen? We keep on coming back to this idea of Macbeth, the title of the play. Okay? Where the place upon the heath. Not chance again. They know exactly after the battle where they will meet with Macbeth. Upon the heath. A barren, wild place again. And they say, there to meet with Macbeth. It's not going to wait around and go, he's not here yet. They know where he's going to be, when he's going to be there. Okay? And then they get ready to go. I come, Grey Malkin. Now, Grey Malkin is the word for a cat. Paddock calls. Paddock is the word, the name of a toad. So whether actually Shakespeare is saying at this point, one of the witches turns into a cat and another one turns into a toad, I don't know. Maybe they just call themselves that name because those are the things that they can transform into. Okay? But we've got another power. We've got these powers of prophecy. We've got these powers of making spells. We've got the power of, in this case, being linked to animals or transforming into animals. And then we've got these final 2 rhyming lines. Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through fog and filthy air. This is the key line of this scene. Fair is foul and foul is fair. They are going to, just like Richard III did, because they are intent on creating chaos, they're going to turn everything upside down. So what appeared foul will be fair, and what appeared fair will be foul. That is good and bad. And that's a theme all about disguises as well. Someone who appears fair and decent and good and kind and honest and loyal will be anything but. Okay? There's a corruption that goes on of Scotland because of that. So fair is foul and foul is fair. And look at the balance of that. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da. Okay, fair is foul and foul is fair. And they're going to turn that the other way around. That's what these witches are intent on doing in these lines through their spell. And then hover through fog and filthy air, they disappear. They use that other power they have of flight or disappearance, and they go. Okay. Now I'm going to go on to the next scene. I'm going to stop this one now, but hopefully that's given you a better understanding, maybe of a scene that you would have been aware of, a play that you should be aware of in Macbeth, and a scene that you've probably been aware of, but maybe didn't understand that it had actually the importance that it does, because from that we get a sense that everything that Macbeth, the character, does thereafter, there is a sense of inevitability. Do you remember I said about these ideas of conventions of tragedy, that you have someone who comes into conflict with a power which is much greater than themselves, but ultimately will lose. Macbeth is coming into conflict with these witches, the idea of fate. Okay? But ultimately he will lose it. But from Act 1, Scene 1, there is an inevitability that that is going to happen. It's going to happen. We know that from now, because the witches have made it so. Alright? So you can see again exactly what I'm talking about, the similarities between this and ideas, at least, in Richard III. Okay? Next one, which I will film probably later today, the next one is going to be looking at Act 1, Scene 2 to Act 1, Scene 4, because there's some really important things that happen in those scenes which sets up the introduction to the villain that we are going to be looking at, not Macbeth, a bit too obvious, but his wife, Lady Macbeth, and the role that she plays in this play. Okay?